Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this Monday's edition of the This Is Not Therapy Hour. My name is Marie. I'm an executive functioning coach. I work in association with Effective Artistry, which is run by Brandon Tessers, who joins me as always today. Effective Artistry is a therapy practice based in Northbrook, Illinois, and providing therapy services to anyone in the state of Illinois. For executive functioning coaches, there's a number of us working around the world who can provide coaching services to you wherever you are in the world. It's a neurodiversity affirming practice, so a lot of what we talk about on the stream will connect not just to mental health, but to the concept of neurodiversity. And as the title of the show suggests, this is not therapy, but it's a chance for you to have a conversation with Brandon, ask questions about things you might be curious about that you might not otherwise have an opportunity to talk about. So if you want, you can pop a message in the chat to ask us any questions that are on your mind, and I will read them out during the chat, and Brandon will answer them as best he can. And if you want your comments to remain anonymous, that's absolutely fine. Just bear in mind that when you do post, if you're on Facebook, Twitch, or YouTube today, that your questions will come up under your own name, but I won't read out your name when I'm asking the questions of Brandon. I think that's everything. I always say that, but I'm never sure if that's everything.
I always do when I do the spiel or used to do that. I used to say the same thing every time. You're so like smooth and professional at it these days.
Practice.
It's not like futzing with stuff while you're doing it and ruining it all. I'm glad to be here. Obviously, I've set this up so I can have a different like Zoom when I'm meeting with session or with clients, so they can see more of my body and try and replicate meeting in person more. And now that it's for a stream, all of a sudden I feel like I'm doing like an old fireside chat kind of a thing. Like this.
And I feel like my head is huge next to
I didn't consider that part of it. I mean, frankly, it's also just a lot more comfortable to sit in this chair than to sit in my desk chair and do it from that other angle. So
yeah.
It's kind of selfish, but
Comfort is important. I've got my comfy clothes on for this, and I've got my cup of tea. I see you have your cup of tea at the ready as well. So I guess let's get into it.
yeah, that's good.
So last week we talked about accommodations in the workplace. This week I thought we would talk a bit about accommodations in education. Of course, I'm based in the UK, you're based in the US, so some of these systems will be different, but there'll be a lot of commonalities in how we approach these things. But I guess depending on whether we're talking about younger age groups or college, university, there might be different steps and procedures that people need to go about to request accommodations. But before we get into that, I guess maybe it's a good idea to reiterate what we mean by accommodations. So I'll ask you to do that because you're very good at defining these things.
Yeah, well, for today's conversation, for the purposes of the conversation today, when we say accommodations, we're talking about things that you are officially requesting from the school, if that's what we're talking about today, that the school must provide. They have a process by which, and like you said, my knowledge is limited to the United States system. And even more specifically, I'll say Illinois, although to the best of my knowledge, these things are all federal laws. So it should be roughly the same all across the country. But yes, there are legal mandates and requirements in terms of schools, in this case, having to provide accommodations in order to ensure reasonable, equitable access. So that's when we're talking about accommodations, that's what we're talking about today. It's like the official stuff that you go through an official process of requesting from the school and that they provide to you in an official way. Not the version of using accommodations that we did some last week about just different ways to be able to change things, provide supports for yourself or for others in an unofficial capacity to kind of make things go more smoothly or be less costly.
Okay. So I guess the first thing in identifying what accommodations are needed before you even get that far, you, I guess you have to be aware that there's something um, happening in your child's school day that needs to be adjusted or amended to allow things to go more smoothly for them. You may or may not have a diagnosis of a learning disability or um, something along those lines. Are there different? I guess you say yeah. The most what you know best about is the state of Illinois. But are different processes or roughly similar processes for seeking assessment?
Yeah, so unlike the workplace accommodations, where all of that you're talking about is going to be driven by the individual who's looking for accommodations, school accommodations are done differently. Uh,
Mm.
because the child, depending on how young we're talking, a child is not likely to recognize that they would benefit from accommodations or know that accommodations are even a thing that might exist. So they're not going to be the one generally driving the process until you're getting into like maybe middle school, high school, and even then it tends not to be driven by the student. Uh, Parents might drive the process a little bit more, and that goes a little bit differently too. And then mostly, usually, when these things happen, it's initiated by the school, the educators. They're noticing something happening at the school setting that they want to explore and address. Um, College is a whole separate thing.
Mm.
For college stuff, refer back to last week a lot more. It's a lot more like workplace accommodations. Each school has its own. They are required to provide things, but they'll call it, the Office of Student Services in one place, or Disability Services in another place, or Equitable Access, or sometimes they just have like acronyms that they think are avoiding saying anything unpleasant. Right? Like some people think disability is a term they shouldn't use, for example. So every university, college, everything is going to be different depending on your school. So we're mostly going to focus on what in the States we call elementary school, middle school, and high school, or sometimes junior high, but we'll say elementary, middle, and high. Yeah, it depends. So you help me clarify so I don't just run through a bunch of different options. Should we talk about this starting from like the parent's perspective?
Yeah, I think that could be useful. Yeah. Um, I'm guessing that from the teacher's perspective, some things are going to notice are behavioral, but um,
Well, pretty
I
much
guess
everything,
same for parents too, right?
right? Like when we're talking about disability, a lot of what we mean when we're talking about things like invisible disabilities, for example, is just that there are some things which happen in the subjective internal experience that is not visible to the outside. And
Mhm.
especially when talking about neurodiversity, like neurodivergent people, and especially women, a lot of this stuff tends to be that from the outside, no one knows that there's anything amiss because the problem is that it's costing too much, but we're still paying that high cost. So we're still accomplishing what we're asked to accomplish, but it's taking, we're having anxiety and panic attacks and et cetera, et cetera. Um, so yeah, whether it's from the educator or the parent's perspective, in either sense, it's going to be from behavior. Now, nobody here watching this is going to do this, but just to be clear about what happens, there are many parents who will initiate processes like this not based on behavior or their child's report, their self-report of their experience at school, but because they're seeing flagging, what they consider to be flagging grades or test scores. They think the kids are not doing as well, they're not as successful as they would like them to be, which is valid. I'm not trying to say that this is like these parents care about the wrong thing, although certainly some parents are, you know, have certain expectations and are not very interested in alternative perspectives. But that should not make anyone shy away from saying, I know, like, for example, a very common thing to call people's attention to this is my child has always done well in school generally, or has always done well in a particular kind of subject. And all of a sudden there's a huge change. You go from straight A's to straight F's, and it doesn't need to be that exaggerated, but you notice big changes either across the board or within a particular subject area very quickly. That's a good sign that there's something going on that an accommodation could help with. because it's unlikely that their ability to interact with and maneuver, navigate the content shifted that significantly. So it's much more likely that either some demands are being made of them that they don't understand, or something in the environment is being done in a way that doesn't work well, or something like that. So there is that. But mostly people here are probably going to be focused on a combination of that plus their kids are saying that they're struggling or having a hard time, or they're getting reports from the school that the kids are having a hard time.
Yeah.
As far as initiating the process for parents, you can request it. You can go to your school and ask that they initiate a process. But this is school evaluations are very resource intensive processes on the school's part. It takes a lot of people's time and energy to do this stuff. Everything is covered in triplicate and it's very thorough, which in some senses is really, really great. In other senses can be problematic. So requesting an evaluation does not guarantee that you're going to get a full on, like the process that we'll talk about going through this whole step. But it does start with talking to your child's teacher and asking that they keep an eye on things, and teachers will start keeping data and records because, again, legally they are required to pay attention to this stuff. So if the school is completely rebuffing you, just saying, oh, no, we don't think there's anything to look at there, that shouldn't be happening. I doubt that will happen. They might give you the sense that they don't think there's anything worth looking at there, but if they go straight up into, no, we think your concerns are unfounded, without doing any kind of an evaluation process, that's not how they're supposed to do it. So if they're doing it that way, just know that that's not how it's supposed to be done.
It's good to know. Yeah.
But the evaluation process will start with classroom observation. So if you go to them and say, hey, I think there's a problem with this, this, or that, and they say, okay, we'll keep an eye on it, then that's a valid thing. And if they come back and you want to talk to them again a month later or whatever, and they say, yep, we have not seen anything that indicates that an evaluate, we should move further in this process or whatever, then they might say that. At that point, a lot of parents, if you have the means and are interested, will go to private diagnostic channels, particularly neuropsychological assessments, which can be expensive. I mean, insurance can cover them and they can cost nothing, or you can be paying $4,000 out of pocket to a private assessor, which a lot of parents will do because certain different assessors get reputations for being especially prone to finding certain diagnoses in the people that they're looking at. I would never, I'm sure that there are some people out there acting in good faith, but that's not what I'm talking. I don't mean that, not referring to people that you go and you pay them and they give you the diagnosis you want. Although I don't know anybody like that. I have heard that things like that are possible. But different people have their different specialties. If someone specializes in evaluating for giftedness, for example, then you're more likely going to come away from that with them seeing it through that lens and whatever they find being interpreted through that lens. I don't know why I'm trying to be so vague, like I'm trying to protect people's feelings here.
You're just being diplomatic.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that the parents have the means, they can go to another and another and another and another until they get the result that they want. So there are people that use the system in that way. And then you have some paperwork, you can come back to the school and say, nope, they're officially diagnosed with X, Y, or Z. You have to do a full evaluation process. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, though, it's going to be the educators coming to the parents saying, I think we need to take a look at this and that, which, knowing a lot of educators, and I'll be clear here that the vast majority of every stakeholder here, the kids, the parents, the educators, all of them, I'm sure there are rare exceptions, but the vast majority of everybody is doing their best. Everybody has the child's best interests at heart. Yeah. People have different ideas about how to support a child, and that can be problematic, but generally people are wanting to do its best. One of the particular issues that comes up with accommodations is that some people, and this tends to be more likely for people who are here watching this stream, really believe there's a lot of value in having a diagnostic label and being provided official accommodations, Whereas some people are think that like giving a diagnostic label is a bad thing to do, that it
Mhm.
should be avoided at all costs. So educators are often very hesitant. They're nervous to talk to parents about this stuff because you never know if a parent is going to be the kind of parent that responds with, "How dare you say my child be struggling with something you don't understand?" That like some parents, if you suggest that there might be a learning disability, are going to be upset or hurt or sad or furious or whatever. So you know, just bear that in mind as a parent. If you're wondering whether something's going on, there is a window of the teachers think that there might be something worth looking at, but it's not drastic enough for them to think that they should go to you and push it with you. Where if you approach it with them, then they might be willing to say, "Yes, I have noticed some similar things, and I was wondering some stuff myself."
Mhm.
Because yeah, by the time the educator comes to the parent, problems have escalated. It's got to be past a certain, it's going to change for each person, but there's a certain threshold at which it's like, okay, now we have to have this conversation. And I'll say, particularly in regards to autism, you and I, Marie, and probably most of the people here watching the stream tend to view autism very, very differently than most people in this culture. Most people still do think of it. There's a reason Autism Speaks, for example, is like the biggest autism organization. Most people think of a child getting an autism diagnosis as, oh, how sad, how terrible, right? And you and I, we know that that doesn't need to be what it is. In fact, no matter what is happening with a child or anyone, getting a diagnosis of autism changes nothing about who they are or how they operate. They're the same before the diagnosis as they are afterwards. It is not like, oh, you have cancer, like there's something we didn't know. It's just applying a label.
Mhm.
Uh, Now, this one is state by state, and I only know Illinois, but there are, at least in Illinois, there's something called an educational diagnosis of autism, where they have a different set of diagnostic criteria that overlaps with the DSM criteria. So they can diagnose autism in an educational setting without saying that it is clinically diagnosed autism, which I
Okay.
don't know the history behind it, but I imagine is because they got enough pushback from enough parents saying, "No, how dare you? My child's not autistic," but they do see something there that they need to address. So they kind of came up with this workaround of like, okay, yeah, maybe, maybe not. We're not talking about it in that way. We just mean in the educational setting, they exhibit these behaviors or whatever.
And then that gives an opportunity then to put those accommodations in place.
Yeah, because in order to get accommodations in a large organization and these schools specifically, it's finite resource. Like every child with accommodations will be assigned a caseworker. There are only so many caseworkers, and the vast majority of them, and the vast majority of schools and school districts, have caseloads that are way beyond what they should be asked to manage. So there are finite resources, and there has to be some gatekeeping is a term that is typically used in a negative way for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I like to think of it as like in the metaphorical, like the reason we use gatekeeping as a metaphor is because there are gates in real, like actual physical gates that prevent people from getting into something. And sometimes that is terrible when what is being gated off is potentially beneficial or enjoyable, and it's the gate is there to maintain exclusivity. But sometimes it's very beneficial or even necessary when it's like what's behind this gate is very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, right? So this is one of those cases in which, not that this is dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, but this is one of those cases in which it's necessary. It's unfortunate, but it's necessary because the school systems don't have the resources to be able to just give everybody anything.
Yeah.
I wish that that were how it is, and we could have a different conversation about like how I think, or how we might wish that education broadly was structured, but that's not how it is. So there does have to be an evaluative process. It doesn't necessarily need to come out with a particular diagnosis or a diagnosis at all, It can just be, like, for example, unspecified learning disorder is an official diagnosis, but it doesn't even necessarily need to be that. It can just be addressing like a generalized struggles with or generalized weakness with, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
Uh,
And can you identify things like sensory sensitivities without having to put a label of autism or ADHD or whatever on it?
I don't know if there's a yes or no answer to that question. So maybe not. There's maybe we'll have time during this hour to get into, there are still unofficial channels for accommodations, especially as you get older, uh, for you as an individual to go to your teachers and just say, like we were talking about at the end of last week, hey, I do best with X, Y, or Z. The further on you get in the grade levels, the more open teachers tend to be in supporting you in whatever way best works for you. They tend to be more flexible. It doesn't always happen, but it tends to be. Uh, and same at the younger levels with parents going to teachers and just saying, without having to go, like we talked about, exactly the same at the end of last week. You don't necessarily have to go through a process of, because they are blank, 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 therefore you should blank, blank, blank. You can just say, hey, my child does best with structure, or hey, just wanted to let you know he has a really hard time with loud noises. So if there's a fire drill coming up, if you could give him a heads up, otherwise he's going to have a hard time or whatever. You're just sharing, like we talked about last week, you're sharing information with somebody that having that information is beneficial. They don't want your child to melt down at a fire drill, right?
Yeah.
Like that doesn't make their life any better or easier. So there's all that. But as far as official channels, yes, there's going to have to be some official reasoning of why they're getting the support that they're getting. And in particular, they're always going to set very specific measurable goals and very specific metrics that they're tracking to watch progress toward those goals.
Mhm.
I feel like I don't feel super locked in on like specific questions. I'm just kind of giving like a general.
Yeah, no, but that's really useful to give parents and carers, I think, an idea of what the process is like um, from the educator's perspective as well. Because I guess sometimes it just feels like a lot of form filling if you're the parent or carer. You're not getting you're not getting the other side of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of legalese stuff. Like I said, everybody has to do everything in triplicate, and they have to officially confirm that you received your notice of parental rights, and et cetera. Like, because it's a big legal, everyone's got to do it by the book.
Yeah.
I'll say that. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask you last week, you mentioned this in passing, universal design and universal design for learning. So I was going to ask if maybe we could talk a little bit about that and that how that could be implemented, what it is and how it could be implemented.
Yeah, well, that's more on like the advocacy side and the educator, like professional development side, because as a parent, there's not much you can do about it. As a student, there's not much you can do about it. But the basic idea of universal design is to structure things in such a way that it is not necessary that individuals need to request specific accommodations, because the structure itself is open and flexible enough that within that structure, everyone is able to go in a particular way. So,
Presumably that comes down to resources as well, right?
well, yes, and also in this case, a lot of it has to do with curriculum and tracking like school performance metrics and things like that. So, like Montessori is a particular approach to education that a lot of people at least have heard the name, right?
Mhm.
And in particular, what Montessori is, like the kind of general, like the founding, the core premise underlying it all is that self-directed learning is the most optimal learning, that children should have as much autonomy and control, that in an educational environment we should be providing them with opportunities and resources and things of interest, and both in terms of the materials that we've got laid out and the ideas that we're proposing and suggesting to them, but also in terms of the ways in which the educator kind of supports them. But in a Montessori classroom, children will engage with a particular learning center, pouring water into cups. And if they do that for 4 hours, they do that for 4 hours. And if they do it for 20 minutes and then move on to something else, they do it for 20 minutes, move on to something else. There are still expectations involved, right? Like that you don't leave that center without cleaning it up and putting it back into a place there where it can be used by the next person. And
Right.
there's expectations about noise levels and, accommodating one another, whatever. Uh, but it's how do you grade that, right? Like if we're going with universal design, the idea that different people work at different paces and learn in different ways and are best supported by different types of tools and education, we can't really compare people to one another very well that way, which is unfortunately, and nobody wants it this way. This isn't like any teacher or principal or whatever is making it be this. Nobody wants it to be this. But what the education system is a giant ranking system.
Yeah.
It is intended to identify. Everyone will say that the list to teach children, which is every individual person involved, is that person's goal. But the goal of the system is to identify which children have done the most and the best learning important things versus others. There's a reason that when you ask anybody, any kid about school, they're going to tell you what they're good at and what they're bad at. When you ask them about, oh, tell me about math. Oh, I'm bad at math or I'm good at math. It's all comparative stuff. Because there has to be, in order for it to be large scale this way, kind of like the gatekeeping thing, it is necessary for the system as it is constructed, that there have to be a way that we can measure how the schools are doing, right? Like no one would disagree with the idea that we should protect the children from educators who are acting in bad faith or not making a good effort to do what it is that they are meant to be doing. And in order to do that on a large scale, we have to have some way of observing what it is that they're doing and determining whether what they're doing is beneficial or not. And if it's not, what do we do about it, et cetera. And so, we get into tests, which a lot of accommodations has to do with test taking stuff. And we can talk about that. I want to try not to I'm going to get real philosophical and political about this stuff because it is that kind of thing, but I don't want to lose the practicality of like how to navigate the process too.
Okay.
But yeah, if we have tests to measure how one school is doing versus another school, then we're testing the kids. So we have to compare a child's performance against another child's performance. We have to have norms and standard deviation and all that stuff. And even if the stated intent of that is to make sure that the educators are doing well, those scores still follow those kids, right? Like if everyone in a particular teacher's class in high school gets a B minus, no one gets an A. We don't typically look at that and say, oh, that teacher is doing a bad job. That there's something going on there because those kids shouldn't all be getting B minuses. We tend to say to each individual kid, yes, you got a B minus, and here's why. You didn't do this assignment, or you scored such and such on this test. And then they go into a competitive university admissions system, those of them who do, and they have to be ranked against each other. And I think the university system is great for so many things. It serves a unique purpose that nothing else does. And the fact that university admissions are competitive, which again, what's the other? If you're going to have different schools where going to one school is theoretically more beneficial than going to another, well, a lot of people are going to want to go there. And how do you determine who does and who doesn't? And there are alternatives. There are lottery systems and things like that. But obviously, the way things are structured, the most prestigious schools are the ones with the most money. And that happens for a reason. And turning it into a lottery system messes with that system. Anyway, there's a lot of great stuff. I mean, any of us who have gone to college or university, even if we've had bad experiences overall, can probably still tell you about some awesome, fun, great things that happened during that time. Meeting people and being exposed to new ideas and people from different backgrounds, getting out of your small town if you go away to college, a lot of great stuff. But none of that is the stated purpose of the university.
No.
The stated purpose, the official stated purpose, is to educate people. But anybody watching along, finish this statement. I have to get good grades in high school so I can get into a good college so I can
get a good job.
There's no other defensible answer to that. Everybody knows that the end of that sentence is get a good job so I can make a good living so I can have a good life. Which, by the way, is why high schoolers are reacting to things like tests as though they are life and death.
Yeah.
Everyone's wondering why high schoolers are depressed and anxious because they're being told that everything they do on a day-to-day basis will determine whether they have an enjoyable life for the rest of their life or not. That's an appropriate if you gave me a task to do and told me that success at this task would mean I have a good life for the rest of my life and failure means I would have a bad life for the rest of my life, if I didn't react as though it was life or death, that would be very suspicious. I'd be concerned.
Right? This is why people still in adulthood have nightmares about their high school exams.
It's the most common nightmare in the Western world. This is culturally dependent, by the way. Interesting research on this stuff. This is not a universal thing. In the Western world, the most common nightmare involves education or academic environment.
Wow.
That is not the case in other cultures.
So it's a system that puts kids under a lot of stress and pressure.
Yeah.
Despite our best intentions.
Yeah, nobody wants it to be this. That's why I'm trying to hit over and over. Because when I talk about this stuff, obviously the way we're talking about it right now isn't super practical in how to navigate the system as it's constructed. It's more describing some of the limitations and flaws of how some of the unfortunate elements of how the system is constructed. And so people have a tendency to get upset or scared or even defensive, especially when I'm talking with educators, no matter how much, and you've heard me say it several times, no matter how much I make sure to emphasize each educator cares about doing the best they can for each educator is up against all this, that people will still tend to hear this stuff and react with, well, I'm not trying to rank the kids. Yeah, I know. Nobody's trying to do that. No individual, there's no like secret shadowy figure at the head of all this who said, we must do it this way. It's a system. The whole point of systemic thinking, the thing that makes a system is to say that the system can have outcomes which are different from the outcomes each individual member of that, each individual piece of that system is pursuing. If that couldn't be the case, then there would be no point in labeling it as a system, right? Like the whole point is that people within a system can do everything correctly and go for the right outcome based on what we would think the right outcome will be, and the system still outputs a completely different thing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, when the stated purpose of university education is for people to get a good job, again, it's a ranking system. If literally every person had the exact same degree, how could that benefit someone in the marketplace, right? Like, in order for it to be beneficial to you to have a degree, I must be able to compare you against other people who do not have a degree and have you come out favorably. So even though every individual wants this system to be, every child should be able to go to college, every child should be supported, if that actually were to happen, our entire system would collapse. That it doesn't work that way. I mean, that's happened. It's not so dramatic and drastic, but when enrollment numbers get too high, the market corrects. The enrollment numbers have been plummeting over the last 6 years. Colleges have been closing, and likely very, very many more colleges will be closing over the next 1 to 3 decades.
Yeah.
Too many people were getting degrees. This is not a secret, right? Like, we all talk about you got a bachelor's degree in the 60s and you were like a rare breed, guaranteed a good income. You get a bachelor's degree now and you still end up working at Starbucks as a barista. It's a competitive advantage. The more people that succeed, the less valuable it becomes. Which is not to take away the value of going to college and becoming educated. Like I said, all that stuff is great. It's just not what the system is built on.
Yeah.
We can always get off into this stuff.
That's okay. I'm thinking about all of my work colleagues who are overqualified. I'm probably overqualified for some of the stuff I do too, but it is the way things
You're
are now. Yeah.
overqualified.
Pardon?
Of course, you're overqualified for the things that you do. I mean, depending on how you define that term, I suppose, you know. But
Yeah.
I mean, you know, some of my therapists before they were working here had a master's degree and were working stocking shelves at Walgreens, which,
Yeah.
you know, their colleagues didn't even have, some of them at least didn't even have high school diplomas, which is not to look down on that work or say that it's just to say that obviously there are people who go through the process of higher education and don't see that benefit in terms of their actual like employment.
Yeah. I know I went back and got my second degree out of just curiosity and the love of the subject. And that was still a lot of pressure. Um, but I was under no illusions that I was going to come out with a top job afterwards.
I mean, I got my
Different
bachelor's,
experience.
so obviously I am in that boat too, where I, I I don't think the value of a degree or of an education is just to make money, or I would not have been acting. Hell, I
This is
wouldn't have been
a
there.
hot topic here in the UK at the moment, where everyone's being pushed towards STEM subjects and everything in the humanities is being devalued.
Intelligence again and productivity and all this. Anyway, I want to. I don't want to lose the thread on the accommodation system. Just the point before we got onto all this other stuff was to just know that this is a system which is intended to rank individuals one against another, and we can all say that that's not what's happening and that that's not what we intend or what we want to happen. But the kids know that it's happening, just like you knew it was happening when you were in school and you felt bad or dumb when someone else did better than you, and you felt great or smart when you did better than someone else. Like I think that's one of the things that's hardest for adults when they're dealing with children in the school system is you forget that element. As an adult, it's like, oh, how fun. You get to go to school and just learn stuff and hang out with your friends all day and whatever. You forget that all day long, constantly, you're comparing yourself against other people and being compared against other people, and that doesn't always come out well. And even when it does, sometimes that's not great either. You end up putting a lot of pressure on yourself or having pressure put on you or et cetera, whatever.
Yeah.
Just keep that in mind. And that's why the accommodation system is the way that it is. Because the intention of it is to give a level playing field, not to make it so that when you get accommodations, you will now be the most successful. The idea is to say, we want to accommodate you in such a way that you have an equal chance of being successful as everyone else, which is why it necessitates that deficit model, that gatekeeping model where we've got to say, because otherwise, because people will talk about this with accommodations in school, like, oh, that's not fair. You're giving too many accommodations. You're making it too easy and giving them an advantage over other people because it's not, they don't actually struggle enough that they should have those accommodations. So they're trying to like calculate it exactly correctly of what's the minimum accommodations you need in order to have a fair chance without giving you too much to make it unfair to the kids who don't have accommodations. And that's an impossible task, and it's just, you know, everyone's doing their best. And I should say too that the way we're talking about it, the younger you're talking, the less this is applicable.
Okay.
There's not like when we're talking about accommodations for preschool, kindergarten, you know, pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, etc. The vast majority of that is speech and language pathology support, SLP support, because people are struggling with developing speech, you know, speech impediments and things like that. And there's also a huge proportion of it is physical therapy and occupational therapy for people with physical disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
The kinds of accommodations that neurodivergent people tend to be talking about, we're not usually really talking about that stuff until middle school, but mostly high school. And so all this competitive stuff that I'm talking about, we're talking about middle school, but mostly high school stuff. Because it's important to note, I think, in the neurodiversity kind of world, neurodivergent people, I think sometimes lose sight of the fact that these systems are not built with neurodivergence in mind. Like
Yeah.
learning disability is important, and it is part of why accommodation processes exist. But it's the same process that exists for people who are blind and use wheelchairs, and the the learning disabilities in terms of identifying needs and providing accommodations is a much more recent development. That this process exists the same way for everybody. So we tend to get focused on this relatively narrow subset of it. But providing access to the school elevator is an accommodation that people
Right.
get when they physically need to be able to use the elevator to go between floors. Or extra time, being able to show up to classes late because it takes them extra time to go from one classroom to another classroom in a different location.
Mhm.
So when we're talking about young kids, we're almost exclusively talking about occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech and language pathology, and some social emotional, but mostly those things. We're not talking about a lot of learning disability. Autism does tend to be the earliest thing that is identified as a learning in terms of learning disabilities. That we do see people get identified, even officially diagnosed with autism in pre-K and kindergarten, because the things which are most noticeable tend to be associated with autism at that age.
Okay.
The things that would be associated diagnostically with ADHD, for example, or dyslexia, for example, are very difficult to be able to observe at that point. Generally speaking, kids don't read when they enter kindergarten. How are we supposed to determine that some of them are dyslexic? So these things tend to get diagnosed more and more as time goes on. So we are.
I'm thinking of kids I know who were one who was diagnosed with sensory processing disorder quite early on, but didn't receive an autism diagnosis until much later on in his school life. And another kid I know, similar pattern. The dyslexia was identified much later on than an earlier
Yeah,
diagnosis or something else.
that's why DSM-5 it got turned into autism spectrum disorder. Like everyone's focused on the disappearance of Asperger's syndrome, which got rolled into autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5, but so did pervasive developmental delay and nonverbal learning disorder, some other things as well. Actually, I might be wrong about that. Nonverbal learning disorder might still exist. But also just to note, like ADHD first, autism more recently, these things are oftentimes referred to as garbage pail diagnoses, which just means there's a child that we can identify obviously would benefit from some form of support. We can't specifically match up their diagnostic criteria against something like Down syndrome, for example, or something like genetically testable or physically or medically observable or whatever. So now we're into the kind of learning disability or social emotional disorder category of things. And even then, it's not exactly this, it's not exactly that. Autism spectrum disorder, the diagnostic criteria are very broad and vague, and you can make a defense for putting most people into that diagnostic category if you had reason to do so. ADHD was that before. And I don't want to say that these things are overdiagnosed, because that does result in that, like people coming out and saying, oh, everyone has ADHD, everyone's autistic, it's a bunch of bullcrap, whatever. Which is not the point. These labels exist to be useful. They're constructs. It is not like people claiming to have diabetes who are not diabetic. Anyway, different thing. Uh, so it is like, especially in the kindergarten age, for example, if you can identify something's up, this kid seems pretty clearly like they would benefit from some support. If they go through a diagnostic process, it's much more likely to come back as they have autism spectrum disorder or an educational diagnosis of autism or whatever than anything else, which does have a tendency then later to be clarified into something else, right? Especially those educational autism diagnoses. Once the behavior changes, whether because the person is well supported or they grow and develop in some way and changes the way they respond or whatever it is, then they'll say, yep, they no longer qualify. And some people will mislabel that as they no longer have autism, they're no longer autistic, they've been cured, they've grown out of it, et cetera, which does feed into this idea that because when they're young, it's very generic. We don't have a lot of specific stuff. And later on, we might get more specific and say, oh, you know what we thought was autism seems like it might actually be a language processing disorder combined with ADHD, and we switch it to that. Whatever. It's kind of a mess, but it works. And so you just kind of navigate it the best you can while we advocate. And there are many organizations dedicated to advocating for making it a better system. But you need to do your best. So back to some practical stuff, because I want to clarify something. Some quick, like, logistical things. There are two different types of documents or plans or whatever that will grant a person access to accommodations. And I think it's useful to there's what's called a 504 plan, and there's what's called an IEP, an individualized education plan. The difference between the two, there are many differences in practice, right? Like, people who get certain types of accommodations are more likely to have an IEP or a 504. But in like a categorical way, the difference is in order for us to change anything about the curriculum that a person is expected to study, to be taught, it has to be an IEP. So if you're going into special education classroom, it has to be an IEP. If we're removing one of your classes to give you a resource period, it has to be an IEP. If we're putting you into, waiving your language requirement, it has to be an IEP. Anything where we're modifying the curriculum can only happen with an IEP. Pretty much everything else can happen either on an IEP or a 504. 504 is a behavioral plan, so we can support people in that way. 504 is a less intense, because should be noted too that what's required in this process is least restrictive environment. So in other words, if somebody's dyslexic and we can provide some accommodations for them to be able to succeed in the typical, like what's the word on the gen ed classroom, the general track classroom, then we wouldn't pull them and put them into a special ed classroom, because that would be more restrictive than is necessary. So they are required to do, that's the official, like that's the legal term of least restrictive environment. They are required to give the bare minimum. If they do too much, then they could be, validly accused of removing a child from a place where they'd have opportunities to do things that they should have opportunities to do. In other words, nobody wants to be told, oh, your child can't handle a general education classroom, they need to be put into special ed, when you don't think that that's an appropriate thing. Like, there are obviously many cases in which we want our children to be supported in that way. That's why those things exist. But if you and your child think that they are doing fine in a gen ed classroom and the school tells you, nope, we got to put them in special ed, you're not going to be happy about that. So they'll do a 504 plan unless it is determined that a change in the curriculum is necessary. They'll only do that if that's what's determined. These diagnostic processes, so to qualify for to be granted an IEP or a 504 is a big process that must be renewed every 3 years. So every 3 years, the child gets reevaluated, the full evaluation process to determine whether an IEP is still necessary and beneficial, whether they can be graduated down to a 504 or taken off of either plan completely. Same with a 504. And it's also the other direction, right? If you're on a 504, they're evaluating to see, should we step this up to an IEP, keep it as a 504, or take it away completely. There's also an annual review. So every year, you'll do a review of the school is reporting on progress towards goals, what work is being done, what accommodations are being provided, so that we all make sure that we're on the same page and things are working out. If we're not seeing any progress, then there's a problem and we want to look at that kind of thing. So every year you do that. Every 3 years, you have to renew, I'm blanking on the correct term here, but being granted. Again, we're talking mostly, because of who's here, and we're talking mostly about learning disabilities and neurodivergence, social emotional stuff. not talking about medical stuff so much because that is a different process. And frankly, one I don't know a lot about, but assume it's fairly straightforward when there's like medical documentation to say, here's a thing, and whatever. When it comes to learning disabilities and other things that people would generally consider to be neurodivergent, things that fall under that umbrella, then it gets a lot more flexible. Different diagnosticians will do different things. So, like for example, you might get evaluated through the school, get a result that you disagree with, go get a private neuropsych assessment, and come back to the school and say, "See, it is official now," and then they reopen the process. And you,
Oh, we have a question in the chat.
you,
Not sure how much more time you guys have. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you'd recommend for someone who identifies as chronically bored.
in the education environment specifically.
I hope so. I hope it's not the stream that's boring you.
In terms of official accommodations, unless you're going to get diagnosed with, in that case, it would probably be something like ADHD.
Yeah.
Or the other thing that's very common for that kind of an experience is if the school, gifted education, it also falls under the umbrella of special education, which means that it also has a process by which children are identified. It's not the same by any means. Mostly it's about like a test score. If you score a certain, then you can put into the gifted class. You can look into that kind of thing because boredom in the classroom is very stereotypically a gifted kid issue. Like gifted programs are very focused on managing boredom. The truth is that giftedness and neurodivergence and all these things all overlap and go together and maybe are the same thing and whatever. And so the difference between a kid that we identify as, oh, they're acting out because they're bored because they're gifted, versus a kid that we say, oh, they're acting out because they have ADHD and they need to be medicated, which some people want to be medicated and some people don't, but get referred, recommended either way. It has a lot to do with other variables besides the child and how they're behaving, right? There's a lot of things that factor into how we might look at that. Otherwise, we're talking about unofficial accommodations, whether that's talking to your teacher about being able to do different things or just you having different ways of navigating the classroom.
Yeah, just a follow-up reply. It feels like I'm constantly bouncing around between interests. Can't stay interested in one thing for more than like a few weeks. So okay. That's a classroom setting. Yeah.
That's I'm similar, and I'm sure you would say that you're similar. That's a different thing because the first question that I would have to ask is, why is this a problem? It's not a problem. I'm not intending to imply that it isn't a problem. I'm saying some elements of that are problematic for you, or you wouldn't be talking about it, but some are not. There are plenty of things. Binge watching television, for example, is something that is considered to be very normal. That most people will. I get real into a show, I'm all about it, and I watch it for 2 weeks, and then I'm done, and I move on. Right. So, getting very interested in something for a couple weeks and then moving on isn't inherently problematic. So you want to identify what are the actual problems and try to address that. Part of the issue, likely, I'm guessing here, and you please clarify and tell me where I'm wrong because I'm wrong all the time, but part of the issue here is likely the fact that you have identified that the problem here is the boredom.
Yeah.
Right? That because you get bored easily, which makes it about a personality issue and a flaw of yours as a character flaw, as opposed to anything, the things that you're being presented or asked to do or the environments you find yourself stuck in or whatever, right? It's not that it's not accurate. Obviously, you would know you're bored. You're bored all the time. That's your experience and it is accurate. It's not typically very useful, which is why you're asking this question now, because what do you do about it? Because here's the simple answer to any question anyone could ever ask about what do I do to deal with the fact that I'm bored is, well, do something that you find interesting, right? So the issue here isn't that you're bored, it's that either for some reason when you're bored, you don't have access to things that are interesting, maybe nothing seems interesting, maybe you're trying to force yourself to continue to do something that you've been focused on for the last 2 weeks because you don't want to give up on it and move on like you keep doing and you're beating yourself up or whatever, and therefore keeping yourself trapped and bored in that way. Maybe people need things from you and you just don't have it, or you're at work and you can only do some or whatever, lots of things. But you identify those problems and deal with them because boredom writ large, boredom is a general concept. No, there's nothing we can do about just I get bored. That's like saying, what should I do about pain? It depends on what the pain is and what's causing it. And I wouldn't want actually, in the same way that if someone said they have pains, I wouldn't want to teach them to ignore those pains. I wouldn't want to teach somebody to ignore their boredom. That's a signal. It means something. So
there's a follow-up comment here just to clarify. The problem is I also have some long-term goals that can't possibly be done in a couple of weeks. So it feels like I just lack drive or motivation to achieve what I want to. We've only got a few minutes left, but motivation is something we've talked about a bit, I think.
And we can talk more, but also remind me next week, I do want to talk more about, I didn't get through all the practical stuff because I spent too much time on the other stuff about it is something I would like to provide specific practical information to people as a resource on how to navigate it. And I don't think I did a great job of that. So let's revisit that. But this question here and now. So that's kind of what I'm referring to when I say that looking at the problem as being the fact that you get bored isn't necessarily useful, because if that's the way you're looking at it, then there's no real other path to go down besides how do I motivate myself to stay focused on a thing, right? And again, it's not that motivation is not a thing necessarily, just like it's not that laziness isn't a thing necessarily. It's just that those are useful ways of describing something, but don't actually give you anything to do. Like, part of why you've been stuck on this is because you've identified it as a boredom issue and a motivation issue, and there's nothing to do about that. People will sell you stuff all the time saying, well, get motivated in this way, get motivated. But all of that is just some version of saying you have to think about it differently, want it differently, and some like care more. And none of it works because what is that? Like, what levers do you flip in your brain to just care more? You care.
Yeah.
You care, or you wouldn't be talking about how this bothers you. It bothers you because you care about something that you're struggling to do. So I'm not saying that that way of talking about it is inaccurate. It is not, but it's not been useful to you. So I would still focus at the beginning on the same questions. If you think of it as, I cannot focus on anything, I can't do anything consistently for longer than 2 weeks, that's definitely not true, because you eat every day for longer than 2 weeks, right? And of course, that's a ridiculous example, and I'm not trying to be dismissive. I'm just trying to point out we want to subcategorize things. We want to get more specific. There are some things that you not only have done for longer than 2 or 3 weeks, but have done for your whole life without effort at all. There are some things that you want to do every day for longer than 2 or 3 weeks, or consistently for longer than 2 or 3 weeks. So there are other variables involved besides just that you struggle with motivation and boredom. I'm not saying that you don't. I'm saying there are other variables involved, and exploring those other variables are likely to unlock some more useful ideas about things to try than just thinking, I got to somehow make myself be different than I am, which doesn't tend to be very useful. So I would say, first of all, and we don't have time to do this here today now, although please feel free to come back or send us a message or whatever. And if you want to answer some of these questions, I'd be happy to go back and forth and give responses about it. But also just as a thing that if you'd rather do it, you can go away and think about these things. Identify the things that you do struggle, that you want to be doing that takes longer than 2 or 3 weeks, and B, that you struggle to keep doing for the length of time that is necessary in order to accomplish it the way you're trying to accomplish it. As opposed to things that you struggle to stay focused on for more than 2 or 3 weeks, but that doesn't cause you a problem, that you move on from them, which is a difference. And as opposed to things that you stay focused on for more than 2 or 3 weeks, maybe without a problem or maybe with some effort or minimal, but you do it successfully, which is a difference. And you might be able to start to identify some things here, right? That some other variables about, the stuff that falls into this category where it's important to me to do it for longer than that, but I struggle, seems to be different from these other two categories in certain ways. So just to give an example of not that specific thing, but why being able to distinguish from this stuff can be useful, like we were talking about. If we just say, how do we support a kid who's acting out in the classroom? Well, like, that's too general of a question to be able to do anything, right? But not every, like, even kids who act out in the classroom, whatever that means based on the person saying it, they don't do it every single moment. There are other variables involved besides just the kid is constructed in this way. And once we do that, instead of making it about, oh, it's a behavior issue, they don't care enough, whatever, this is part of why accommodations in these processes exist. Once we start to get more specific and detailed and looking at, well, what are the patterns of when they start to act out? And all of a sudden we realize, oh, it tends to be in the lunchroom, tends to be in the gym, tends to be at recess. Okay, well, what are some things that those three areas have in common? Well, there's a lot of sound going on in big echoey spaces. I'm using this example because it's so common and I've seen it so many times of, like, literally the number of times someone's come in and said, my kid just has he's such a nice kid. She's such a nice kid. They're such a nice kid. They're so great. They're wonderful to have in the classroom. But then they just have these tantrums or these outbursts, or they get physically violent all of a sudden out of nowhere, or all of a sudden they're yelling like it's just like a whole different person or whatever. And we identify that it's happening in those three places over and over again. And we take a look at it and, oh, yep, there's an auditory sensitivity going on. That means that they're just getting put into fight or flight, where they're reacting as though it is a dangerous situation. And so a certain type of stimuli is going to generate a certain type of response, right? So same thing here. We want more detailed, specific information. You have been given reason to believe, and it's not an inaccurate thing, because these are what the words mean. You've been given reason to believe that your struggles with being successful with these things, in regards to these things, is because of a personal flaw, that you struggle to stay focused, that you are prone to boredom, that you are not motivated, which may be accurate, but it does also prevent you from looking at, well, what other things might be involved? What environmental conditions, what support might I benefit from that I don't have access to, including, a lot of the time, what support does literally everybody else who does this thing have access to that I don't and don't even know? Right? That stuff just gets overlooked. We make assumptions that because I know I struggle with boredom and focus and motivation, then anytime I struggle, I'm just going to chalk it up to that again. When if we look at the patterns, and we might find, like, oh no, you're being asked to do 80 hours worth of work in a 40-hour work week. You're not struggling just because you're not motivated. You're struggling because you've been given an unreasonable amount of things to do, and everyone will struggle.
Do you have time to answer this follow-up question from the same viewer?
Maybe super quick.
Okay, the question is, what I'm thinking about now is, how do I reframe my goal in such a way that it becomes as important to me as eating or drinking or breathing? If it was starting a successful business, would I need to view it as a life or death? It feels difficult to take an abstract thing like losing a house because we don't make enough money and make it an immediate and imminent threat.
Yeah. No, don't make it life or death. That's going to make it worse. First of all, that's what you've been trying. You've already been trying to make it more important to you. You don't need to make it more important. As you've made it more important to you, it hasn't enabled you to do the things you're wanting to do. It's just made you feel worse about the fact that you're not doing them. You're manipulating the value, but you're not looking at the cost, to use our language. And I don't know who's asking this. If you've been around, if you've heard us talk about some of these things, then great. But if not, you can look back at older things, or we can talk about this later. There's cost and there's value. You do not need to manipulate the value. My real quick example, right? If I ask you, would you like $1 million? You're going to say yes. And I say, great, give me $2 million and I'll give you $1 million. And then you don't want to do it. And I can say, you just said you want $1 million. Here's an opportunity to have $1 million. It's a version that it happens all the time. You say you want to learn, but then you're not doing the things that you need to do to learn. You say you want to get an A, but you're not doing. You say you want to start a business, but you're not doing. So I'm just making it about $1 million and $2 million to make it obvious, but it is that. Now, we can change that. Someone who isn't willing to pay $2 million to get $1 million, well, even though that's valuable and they want it, it's not worth the cost. We can make it more valuable. So now I say, okay, fine. You give me $2 million and I'll give you $3 million. So you do actually net $1 million. I have made it valuable now. You actually get the thing that you want. Now do you want to do it? Well, not if you don't have $2 million. You want to do it, but you can't. And if I say, fine, drive a hard bargain, I'll give you 4 million. You still can't. 5 million, you still can't. 10 million, 20 million, you still can't. The more valuable I make it, it doesn't enable you to all of a sudden spend resources you don't have access to. It just makes you feel worse and worse and worse about the fact that you aren't doing the thing. So no, you don't need to make it more important. It's important. It's not a motivation thing. Like, I will have people sit there and tell me they're not motivated enough to do a thing that causes them to break down and cry on the bathroom floor in the middle of the night because of their inability to do the thing. That's not a motive. You want to, I wouldn't want anybody to want to do it more than the amount of wanting to do it that makes you cry on the bathroom floor in the middle of the night. But that's what everyone focuses on. Those are the messages you've been given, that you just don't care enough. So that's where we focus. Has it been getting worse? I mean, you can answer in the chat, or not answer at all. I'm going to have to go either way. But just as a quick, over time, have you been feeling worse and worse and worse about your inability to do the thing, even though your efforts towards doing the thing haven't gotten any significantly better? And it's not a value thing. It's a cost thing. And you got to look at the specific things that are happening so that we can start to evaluate, why is it so costly for you specifically? Starting a business, for example, I've started a successful business, and I had a hell of a lot of money that I had access to through family connections in order to be able to do that. Before I had access to that, I was the same person. I mean, of course, I'm always growing and learning and developing, but I thought that things, I am who I am, but I didn't start a business back then. It's not all about you and the things that you have internal to you as an individual, which, would be nice if it was, because then it would mean all you have to do is change how you think and feel about things, which I think is part of the reason that we get stuck on this, because it's nice to believe that, oh, if I just change how I think, then it will happen. But especially neurodivergent people, the lesson that we need kind of repeated to us over and over and over is, a lot of problems get solved when I change how I think. Not everybody. Some problems only get solved when I change what I'm doing. And thinking about it doesn't always make me do things differently. Sometimes I just need something. Sometimes I need support. Sometimes there's something I don't know. Sometimes, hell, even sometimes there are things that I just am not going to be able to do because the resources that I would need to be able to accomplish it, given who I am, I don't have access to, or if I was different in some way, I could do it with fewer resources. Sometimes we do realize, is it theoretically, hypothetically possible that I could do this thing? Yes, but practically not right now. So then I got to shift to trying to develop the ability to get access to the things I need, and so on and so forth. Just come back and we'll talk more, but please take that as your takeaway. If nothing else, you don't need to beat yourself up about this any more than you currently are. Look at the specific practical things that are happening so you can identify some observable, manipulable thing external to you. So there's something you can actually try besides just telling yourself once again that you're doing it badly. That was a real spiel, and I got to go. But is there a comment? If there was, I can't respond. But was there another comment?
No, it was just if the follow-up was, the value is measured by desire. So if I want it but I'm not doing it, it's because for whatever reason it costs too much. That's exactly right.
Yeah, sometimes it costs more than it's worth, and then you want to look at manipulating the value, because making it worth more than its cost will make you do it. Sometimes it's worth more than it costs, but you can't afford to pay the cost anyway. And that's a different thing that you want to handle in a different way. And of course, sometimes it's both. But just look at it that way. Is this a thing that I actually don't think is worth what it would cost me? Or do I definitely think this is worth what it would cost me, but I just can't afford to pay it, and I wish I could? I wish I did have $2 million to give you so that you would give me $3 million. I would love to make $1 million for nothing, right? But I don't. All right, I gotta go. I'm super late. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking questions in the chat. I will put some additional links on the YouTube video. The recording will go out again on Wednesday, and I'll put some additional links and resources on that. And hopefully we'll catch up with you again next Monday. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.